the troops in Vietnam, the army in Vietnam qualitatively changes between, say, 1967 and 1969. It goes from being this very disciplined force that follows orders and that performs its missions to the utmost, to being a force that increasingly shakes its head and says, you know what, I'm not doing that.
Hello. As the Vietnam War progressed, discipline among US troops began to deteriorate, to the stage where incidents of fragging, the practice of killing officers and NCOs with grenades, became more widespread, as did the shooting of officers when out on patrol or during contact. This phenomenon encapsulates the latter half of the American presence in Vietnam, as soldiers refused to engage in operations, particularly when there was no discernible objective. Joining to discuss Nixon's Vietnam in this second episode, following on from Saturday's, is Geoffrey Wawro, historian and author of The Vietnam War, A Military History. Jeff also talks about the Vietnamese leadership as well as the reduction in troop numbers as Nixon's secret plan is exposed. Plenty more history on the way, so please do follow or subscribe. And if you can see to giving a kind rating, I'd be most grateful. And even more if you can share with family and friends. But until then, it's me talking with Geoffrey Wawro on the Vietnam War, Part 2. Following on from Saturday's first episode, Jeff, the commitment required for around 120,000 frontline combat troops, those fighting, was to have more than 1 million US soldiers in Vietnam in support. It was never a realistic prospect to do anything other than support the South Vietnamese government then.
Yeah, and my book talks about how the Marine Corps had a different approach. Like they were never comfortable with Westmoreland's big unit war, and they thought it was absolutely absurd on its face. They said, why fight them out on the extreme frontiers when we can't find them? We can't find them. They see where we are. They see us building our fire bases. They see us building our LZs, putting in our air defenses, putting in our wire and everything. They know exactly where we're going to be patrolling, looking for them. So they just come in somewhere else, right? So we're just wasting all this time and money and effort and casualties looking for an invisible enemy. The Marines say, we need to be among the people. We need to be on the populated coastal plain around the cities. We need to be with the people. And they have these CAPs, the combined action platoons, where they embed Marine squads in hamlets. So, and they're gonna secure a village by occupying every hamlet. In Vietnam, they were several hamlets would form a village. So you'd have hamlet chiefs and a village chief, and so the Marines would go into a village and they'd put a squad in every hamlet, and they would defend that village by allying themselves with these local militias, the regional force, popular force militias, or the self-defense forces, and these were extremely successful because those militia forces that did not fight well when they were left to their own devices fought very well when they fought alongside and were coordinated by U.S. Marines. And so they were very good. But Westmoreland hated the idea. He hated the idea because he saw it as being too passive. He said, the war will go on forever if we just kind of hunker down in the villages and defend the villages. And that's not our role. That's the role of the South Vietnamese. We need to be out in the field kicking ass, But the problem was they couldn't find anybody's ass to kick, because the North Vietnamese became so good at avoiding these big American sweeps.
So just turning to the Nixon administration then. So Nixon becomes president in January 1969. Is he's got this plan to win the war, as you've said, not just end it, to win it. But what is his grand plan then? Bomb North Vietnam back to the Stone Age?
Well, Nixon campaigned in 1968 against Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey. And Humphrey was promising to continue the Johnson policy of gradually de-escalating in the hopes of getting a final settlement and a two-state solution. Whereas Nixon said, I have a secret plan to end the war. And the secret plan, such as it was that he was going to kind of accomplish a diplomatic revolution. He was going to reach out to the Soviet Union and Communist China, and he was going to offer the Soviets détente, so a relaxation of the arms race, and, conventionally and in nuclear terms. And then he was going to reach out to Beijing, which, America didn't recognize. We recognized Taiwan. Taiwan had China's seat at the United Nations, right? And so we had this sort of diplomatic boycott of the People's Republic of China. And Nixon was going to reach out to Mao Zedong and do the impossible, have this kind of volte-face where America would recognize China, communist China, and turn our back on Taiwan. And in return, Nixon assumed that he would be able to negotiate that China and the Soviet Union would give less support to North Vietnam and would press North Vietnam to accept the existence of a South Vietnamese state and allow the Americans to arm up South Vietnam and withdraw and get out. And at the same time, while this was going on, the secret plan meant that the United States would encourage Vietnamization. So we would shift the burden of combat from from American troops who were doing most of the heavy fighting in South Vietnam to the South Vietnamese, who would then sort of take over where we left off. And while we were Vietnamizing the war, we would be withdrawing American forces in South Vietnam. So the secret plan was all about de-Americanizing the war, handing it over to the South Vietnamese and giving the South Vietnamese this decent interval to kind of train up on all these American platforms and techniques, and then also getting Soviet and Chinese buy-in to let's have a two-state solution and stop sending so much material to Hanoi and stop encouraging the northern conquest of the South. So, and how did it, how, and part of the secret plan was that in this interim period, before we had Vietnamized the war, while we still had large troop numbers, the troops would come out pretty quickly in 69, 70, 71. By 72, we're down to 20,000 troops from a peak strength of 543,000. But in 1969 and 1970, Nixon wanted to really take the gloves off and like use American forces in South Vietnam to hit much harder than before, and to go into the sanctuaries and attack the sanctuaries and tear up all those camps and make it impossible for the Ho Chi Minh Trail to operate. Well, how did it work out? In 1969, one of the first major op under the Nixon administration in May of '69, the Americans go into that Ashaw Valley that I mentioned before, this big artery of the Ho Chi Minh Trail inside South Vietnam, in the far west of I Corps, the northernmost core area of South Vietnam. And the Airborne Division attacks Hamburger Hill, which is this area that the North Vietnamese Army has been infiltrating down and it guards the Ashaw Valley and the road that carries a lot of their supplies. And they dig in, the North Vietnamese dig in on this on Hamburger Hill, this 3,000-foot peak, and they have bunker lines, and they're flush with the ground, and have overhead covers, so they're proof against artillery and airstrikes, and they just slaughter the Americans who are trying to root them out. And back in the U.S., it just such an outcry because people had voted for Nixon thinking that he had this secret plan, that he was going to get us out of the war, that he was going to Vietnamize the war, and so they're like outraged. And Ted Kennedy leads the charge in the Senate. He goes, "How could you send American boys again and again and again against a hill that had neither tactical nor strategic significance, the possession of which would do nothing to end this war, shorten this war?" And yet, we have dozens and dozens of American casualties on this hill, killed and wounded, and many of them from friendly fire because we were having to napalm and bomb so close to the American troops that we were killing our own people. So there's this, and the Nixon White House is stunned, and they get in touch with Abrams, Creighton Abrams, who's replaced William Westmoreland as MACV commander. They say, "What the hell are you doing?" And Abrams had been told he could do whatever he wanted, but now that Nixon gets political blowback at home, he acts like, "Oh, the generals are exceeding their instructions." No, they weren't at all. Abrams was doing just what Nixon had authorized him to do. But the point is that under Nixon, no less than under LBJ, there were kind of these iron political restrictions on what you could do. The American people had lost their appetite for casualties in Vietnam because they knew that the war was a loser, right? And they knew that we were going to withdraw from this war. So they're like, why do we keep spilling American blood in this senseless war? So Nixon internalizes this, and then so he sort of prods Abrams to kind of dial back the these kind of full-on search and destroy type operations and go more into sort of protecting American troops, encouraging the Army to do more, and he begins the first big drawdowns of American forces. And as I said earlier, when you have such a huge tail to tip ratio, so many rear echelon forces, and you start withdrawing troops, a lot of those are combat troops. So your force of grunts, the actual guys with their ass in the grass, keeps getting smaller and smaller very quickly.
And so it's by 68, is it by the Tet Offensive when American public opinion really turns against the Vietnam War?
Yeah, I mean there was a kind of, well, and remember, it's you had asked me earlier, was there a civil war in the United States
Yeah, it's probably
during?
now's the right time to ask that
Yeah,
question.
I mean, it's a lot like American politics today. When you think about the hardcore percentage of people that vote MAGA in American elections, it's what, 30% maybe, and there's like that kind of support for Nixon's war policy, for intensifying the war in Vietnam. Time Magazine, as the war climaxes, Time Magazine makes Middle America its Man of the Year. And what is middle America? It's kind of the 100 million Americans from sort of middle class households that are very conservative, that think that Vietnam made perfect sense, and that the problem is not the war, but it's the college campuses, it's the hippies, it's the left wing media, right? Now, middle America starts peeling away from the Nixon War. A big crossover point is the moratorium demonstrations in 1970, when ordinary families come out and protest the war, more in sadness than anger, and that's when Nixon really realizes that he can't. But there still is like this hardcore, the so-called hard hats, construction workers, industrial workers who non-college whites basically, who feel like that Nixon's being pushed around by the liberal media and the college kids, and the college kids ought to be in Vietnam. So increasingly, Nixon caters to that constituency. It's part of his whole, the whole Southern strategy that got him elected, by appealing to Southern Democrats to make them vote Republican because they were so affronted by Northern liberals, right? So throughout the war, there's always this hardcore that will support, even after the My Lai massacre. On the radio, there's all these like songs to lionizing Lieutenant William Cowley and talking about he was getting shot at in Southeast Asia while college kids were lying around their dorms like smoking dope. So there's like a kind of a culture war going on, but that percentage of people that are supporting the war does get smaller and smaller with every passing year.
Right. I wanted to ask you about Ho Chi Minh, actually, the man himself, because he's obviously presented as the communist threat back at home in America, but really he's Vietnamese first, isn't he? He wants an independent Vietnam first and foremost.
Yeah, I mean, the debate on Ho Chi Minh is a little bit like the debate on, would Kennedy have got us out of Vietnam, or type of
Right, right.
people, right? We don't really know. I mean, there was a big debate on Ho Chi Minh in 1945, when the Japanese are defeated and driven out, and Ho Chi Minh comes back to found, and he's had contacts with the OSS, the forerunner to the CIA, during World War II. They've been running him as an agent to raise Viet Minh guerrillas against the Japanese, right? And these American OSS handlers of Ho Chi Minh spoke glowingly about him and said, this guy's great. We should make him our guy, and like, yeah, he's a communist, but he's a nationalist first, right? Like just kind of what you said. But then there are other people that said, look, this guy's been in communist academies and training schools for decades. And this guy he believes it, he when he first read Marx and Lenin, he was like absolutely under their spell, right? And he believes in the communist revolution at least as much as the national revolution. So, and he's going to inevitably gravitate toward Beijing and toward Moscow, right? So who knows? Who knows? All we know is that we looked at it through the lens of the loss of China in 1948, and how we couldn't afford another Donnybrook like that. So we had to sort of dig in and oppose him because he was a communist.
The man who took, because he's dead by the time he's dead in '69, isn't he?
Hmm.
And so his Les weren't by then is the top dog in North
Yeah, but
Vietnam.
that's what I show in the book is that we often assume that Ho Chi Minh was directing events until his death in 1969, but no, he'd been nudged out of the picture much earlier than that. By 67, Lê Duan has come back. He'd been running the Southern insurgency, and he comes back to Hanoi and inserts himself into the Politburo. And he's a real bureaucratic knife fighter, and he and his principal colleague Le Duc Tho, they kind of take control of the security apparatus, the secret police, and all the organs of the state, and they basically purge anyone who's not hardline enough in fighting this war, because they realize that the only card they can play against the Americans, who are so rich and have so much great technology, is endurance, the ability to wait the Americans out and to accept high casualties in the times when the Americans actually locate NVA and VC units and are able to destroy them, which they do. It's going to be, I talk about how 90% of search and destroy operations miss their objective, make no contact with the enemy, and yet somehow 1.4 million VC and NVA troops were killed in the war, right? So it just goes to show the ferocity, the utter ferocity of American firepower once you located NVA or VC troops in the field. I mean, it was said that if a company of NVA or VC were located, they wouldn't survive 24 hours. They'd be because of the artillery and the airstrikes, and then the ability to bring in B-52s on quick runs from Thailand or Guam to hit them on their lines of retreat. But anyway, so Li Zuan says, look, endurance is the only thing. We have to just keep taking it until they give up, because we will have protracted the war long enough, killed enough of them, cost them enough dollars that they're just going to say, you know what, the game's not worth the candle, right? So he has to purge people that might have been in favor of a softer approach or of or negotiations or some kind of compromise with the Americans. And so Ho Chi Minh, who's not really he's no great compromiser, but he's older, and his health is failing, and he doesn't have the same kind of fire as he once did. And so Li Zuan kind of pushes him out of the picture, and accuses him of the theory of two errors, letting the French come back in 45 and then acceding to his two-state solution in 1954. And then he uses that theory of the two errors to then purge everybody around Ho Chi Minh and get his own guys in, right? And another guy that gets purged in that and pushed onto the sidelines is Giap, the general who had organized the war against the French in the great victory at Dien Bien Phu. He also is pushed onto the sidelines. And so Li Zuan and he's the one that really insists on total victory. And he's the one who comes up with the idea for the Tet Offensive. And he plans it in 1967. They launch it in January, February 68. They have a second one called Mini Tet in May of 68. They have a third one in August 68. And these are these like pitiless NVA VC offensives against the populated areas of South Vietnam. The idea being you're just going to hit them like a battering ram. And you're never going to beat the Americans. The Americans are too rich, have too much stuff, too much mobility, but you're going to kill enough Americans that the American public and Congress are going to say enough. And you're going to, and in the process, you're going to destroy the ARVN, and you're going to take back any villages that have been successfully pacified by the Americans and the ARVN in the meantime.
Which I guess ultimately it was successful, but just it was such a heavy cost. It was
Yeah.
Millions.
Yes. The yeah, there were mixed estimates for how many of VC fighters were killed in the Tet Offensive.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you again, but is that because the American idea was to, as you've mentioned before, body count? That's the measure of success, the amount of people we kill. So did they overinflate the numbers?
Well, no, it's just because yes, body count was always inflated. So when you talk about civilian casualties in the Vietnam War, they would routinely when there were a lot of civilian casualties, they would just count them as dead VC. But the My Lai massacre, perfect example. There was no VC in that. And those were all old women, young women, children, old men. All the young men were either off in the VC or they were like hiding because they didn't want to be drafted by the ARVN, right? There were no young men around, and yet everybody was counted as VC until the whole thing was exposed, a year later. But so that was typical. But no, it's just because the Tet Offensive and then the mini Tet, they were such big, and they were urban uprisings where the VC would come into the towns and they would literally shelter inside basements, and the houses would be bombed on top of them. So you had to like you had to find all these dead VC guerrillas. So there were wild fluctuations in the number, but anyway, it was a real bloodletting. But the point is that you couldn't, it didn't matter. It didn't matter how many you killed because you had 120,000 young men reaching military age in North Vietnam every year, and you had 2 million men of military age in North Vietnam that hadn't been committed yet. And you had a 1 million-man army operating in South Vietnam in the sanctuaries. So, you could kill, 15,000, 20,000 of these guys, and they were going to replace them. I mean, in 1968, the North Vietnamese army infiltrates 400,000 fillers into South Vietnam to replace casualties, from the Tet Offensive and the other battles around South Vietnam. So it's just like, it's like trying to like bail out a bathtub while the taps are running. It's impossible.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. It's extraordinary that the leadership, I guess, just carried on ploughing away until... So when do numbers start reducing? Is it 71?
You mean American casualties?
Sorry, well, yeah, American casualties, but...
Oh, American casualties start coming down after Hamburger Hill in May '69, when when Nixon basically forbids these big scale combat operations. There was still I talk about it in the book how they still do it, but it becomes much more controversial, and so more and more they shy away from that kind of fighting. And then after the outcry after the Cambodian incursion, where most of the casualties are booby traps and mines because the fighters have gone out. There's this complete revulsion against the war and this determination to really limit casualties. But another thing I talk about in the book is that it's not as if Nixon and Kissinger have this strong hand they can play and they can kind of decide to attack more or less. No, the troops in Vietnam, the army in Vietnam qualitatively changes between, say, 1967 and 1969. It goes from being this very disciplined force that follows orders and that performs its missions to the utmost, to being a force that increasingly shakes its head and says, you know what, I'm not doing that. And the officers have a very hard time keeping the troops in line because morale has been absolutely rotted from within by a combination of factors. Firstly, that both the LBJ administration at the end and now the Nixon administration, they've both confessed that they're not fighting to win the war. They both confessed that they're just fighting to get a better peace, to buy time for South Vietnam, right? And so the troops are like, I'm not going to get killed buying time for South Vietnam, because they have contempt for the South Vietnamese regime and the South Vietnamese armed forces. And they're like, let those guys go fight. Why should I? So the troops are literally refusing to go on missions. And you see discipline breaking down. You see physical manifestations like troops no longer wearing proper uniform, wearing peace signs, wearing love beads, putting all kinds of stuff on their helmet cover and on their flak jackets, right? And then also just refusing to go out on missions, and then if officers or NCOs insisted they do, then fragging the officers. This huge spike in fragging incidents where the troops will kill their officer. They'll either shoot him in the back during an operation, or they'll roll a hand grenade into his bunker or his tent at night. So then
I'd always thought that there were just one or two incidents
oh
like
no,
that,
no,
but
no. I mean, there were too many to count, and only a small percentage were actually adjudicated because the Army and Marines didn't want to talk about this issue. They did not want this aired out in the press at home. So they would, if you were fragged in action by your own men, shot in the back, they would just say it's KIA, killed in action, fighting heroically for his country. And then if you were like blown up in your bunker, in your bunker or in your tent back at the base, that would be hushed up to the extent possible. It would be adjudicated sometimes inside the armed forces, but as little was let out to the media as possible. But I give the numbers in the book. I mean, there was this huge surge in fragging incidents, and so what this did was that it made it very hard for the American Army and even the Marines to operate effectively in the field. I talk in the book. There was a piece in Life magazine, 1969, 1970, about this West Point graduate, Captain Brian Udermalin, who said, and the headline was, "You just can't hand out orders anymore." And he was like saying, "Look, I went to West Point. I'm like a hard charging guy, but like I literally cannot get my company to do anything because if I do, they'll frag the platoon leader or the squad leaders. When these guys go out on patrol, they just kind of walk out of sight of the fire base, and then they settle down in a woods somewhere and they smoke dope, and then they come back, and say, 'Oh, we didn't run into the enemy,' and we're not generating any body count." And we're not even having any contacts with the enemy, and that's quite deliberately. The troops aren't gonna have any more of this war. So you're seeing this happening in 1969, 70, 71. There's an absolute revulsion at the war, and one of the first things that the Nixon administration did when it got in was replace the draft with the lottery. And the idea is that you're no longer going to have this bifurcation of the Vietnam Army between the college kids all get to stay at home and safely ensconced at university, and then whereas the Army in the field is made up of all these like high school dropouts and high school graduates who didn't go to college. And so now you're going to draft all the college kids too, and that ended up predictably that ends up disastrous because you get all these like resentful college kids who are now in combat infantry and don't want to be there, and they're very articulate about how stupid this war is to the guys around them.
one thing we haven't mentioned, but Kissinger's plan, I think, when they're considering peace talks, is to, and this always seems to happen when peace talks happen. Both sides do this. We'll just ramp up our side of the war because we'll get better terms in the peace talks. But Kissinger goes. I mean, the bombing campaign in North Vietnam under the Nixon administration is increased a lot more than under Johnson, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Remember Nixon's secret plan? Part of it was to fight more ferociously, to take the gloves off. And Nixon speaks of the madman theory. That I'm gonna make them think that I got my finger on the nuclear button and I might do anything. Um, so really, the bombing of North Vietnam, which is on the eve of this successful peace conclusion of the peace accords in January of 73. So linebacker one in the spring summer of 1972, and then linebacker two, the so-called Christmas bombings in December of 72 is when Nixon unleashes the B-52s on Haiphong and Hanoi. Right now, previously the B-52s, if they'd been up north, they were bombing along like the DMZ, right? Uh, and they wouldn't be unleashed against civilian centers. And now he's using B-52s, and he's just like absolutely taking out all the infrastructure, lots of civilian casualties, mining Haiphong Harbor, so that, before, Johnson hadn't done that. And even Nixon didn't do it until 72, because, if you mine Haiphong Harbor, you blow up a Soviet ship or a Chinese ship, you might invite them into the war, right? Bombing up those railways crossing the border from China. Neither administration had done that, but now they do. So and it's very effective. It's inferred that that's probably what pushed Lee Zuan to sign the Paris Accords. But it must be said that this was the same deal he would have got from Johnson in 68. So I always say, he probably would have taken it in 68 because it basically gave him everything he wanted. the Paris Peace Accord, trumpeted by Nixon and Kissinger as being a peace with honor, a better peace than Johnson would have got, was the same peace Johnson got. And basically, what it was is we no longer recognize the DMZ as the border between the two countries. There is no longer a border. The border will be decided at some future date by some commission appointed by these two Vietnams. But what two Vietnams? Because Nixon's peace accords leave the North Vietnamese army inside South Vietnam. Whole divisions of NVA combat troops camped inside South Vietnam. In I Corps, the northernmost region, in 2 Corps, the Central Highlands region, in 3 Corps and 4 Corps, which border Cambodia in the south and are around Saigon. It's like they're everywhere. So, and they're just like living off the land indefinitely. And but then Nixon, dares to say, well, I've achieved peace with honor, an honorable peace, a just peace. Chu, the president of South Vietnam, who had spurned Johnson on Nixon's recommendation, said, Nixon has said, don't go to the Paris peace talks. Nixon and Kissinger will get you a better deal. He had spurned those talks and had put his faith in Nixon. And he's like, what do you mean? This is a false peace. This is the same peace that I had, from LBJ. And he's absolutely, he refuses to take part in it. And then Nixon just puts the gun to his head and says, look, if you still want American deliveries of munitions and you want American foreign aid, and you better sign this thing. And so Chu realizes I have no choice, so he has to sign it. But let's be under no illusions that the Nixon peace was essentially no different from the Johnson peace, and it made the war run another 4 years, and it doubled the American casualty bill. To say nothing of the South Vietnamese casualty bill and the communist casualty bill.
Yeah. And then I guess the fall of Vietnam in 75, the fall of Saigon, and then North Vietnam takes over. But the Vietnam we have today, I mean, you visited to write this book. So, I mean, the Vietnam we have today, people go on holiday there. This is a war that was fought. I mean, I think, as we've discussed, the administration was thinking that they weren't really fighting for anything by the end. But when you visit Vietnam today, there's really, this is technically a communist country. What's the legacy for Americans who visit Vietnam today? They must be just, why were we even here in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I mean, when you go there, I would say my most enduring impression is how nice and friendly the Vietnamese people were to me, knowing full well I was American. You think about what we did to that country. 1.4 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong killed, 500,000 South Vietnamese civilian killed, 250,000 ARVN troops killed in the war. It's like, and for what? A war of choice that we waged ineffectually and yet brutally for nearly 8 years, and then just left, and then remember when we left in 73, they kind of fought, they fought as well as they could for the next 2 years, but the problem was, we had the oil shock, so fuel got really expensive, and we were sending them less foreign aid, less gasoline, less munitions, less everything. So they were having to so what happened is the roles flipped between 73 and 75. Now the NVA became the well-supplied military where the Soviets and Chinese were giving them everything they wanted. And, remember Nixon and Kissinger said we're going to detach Beijing and Moscow from Hanoi. Well, they didn't. And so they were really well supplied with the latest air defense systems, the latest armor, advanced fighter aircraft, artillery, you name it. And the South Vietnamese were firing less, training less, flying less, driving less. And so the defeat in 75 was all but inevitable. But then that defeat is followed by these massive communist purges, where anybody who was affiliated with the South Vietnamese army or the militias or the government is purged and either driven into exile, the so-called boat people, or else they're submitted to these re-education camps where they say, oh, we're going to keep you for 10 days or whatever, but they keep them for years, toiling in hard labor in some of the most fever-ridden, inhospitable parts of Vietnam. building roads, building dam, whatever, you name it, public works, in which most, you've got people that were high-ranking officials or college professors that are like, building a road, breaking rocks somewhere for years and years and years. And then once they're released, if they survive, they and their offspring are denied employment in the new communist state because they're seen as being, running dogs of the old puppet forces, right? So, it's just a horrible legacy. And yet you go there today and I mean, it's as if nothing happened, it's just it's they've forgiven and forgotten in large part.
Jeff, I've got to ask one final question. So, what we do sometimes do on the podcast is we do a film every month, and we recently covered Apocalypse Now, which I know is fictional, but Vietnam war films are so influential in the American culture. And I wondered if there was a particular film or TV series or more likely film that you think really conveys the horror, the tragedy, the I don't know, even the comedy to some extent of the Vietnam War. Is there anything that actually that's the wrong word, but is there a particular film that you think encapsulates the conflict?
Well, as for comedy, the word's not entirely poorly chosen because one of the bits of research I did in the book was about Bob Hope went on multiple Christmas tours of South Vietnam to kind of buck up the troops, right? And he would always like circulate these questionnaires to all the places if he was going to Da Nang or Chu Lai or Saigon or Tan Son Nhut or the Saigon Circle, Long Bin Post. He would circulate questionnaires there before he arrived, and he would sort of poll the inhabitants, like what slang is in use, what are the jokes and stuff like that. And I mean, I came across these in the archives, and I was just so, reading Vietnam memoirs, you get a sense, Michael Herr's Dispatches, for example, or, the great novel by Karl Marlantes, Matterhorn, or The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, and so on. You get a sense of the sort of the black humor of American forces in Vietnam, who just thought they were on this kind of on this hopeless mission in this hopeless place, but they were just funny about it. So there was a lot of comedy inherent in this ghastly war. But on the movie front, there's so many. I mean, I love Platoon, right? I think Platoon just does a great job of capturing a lot of the problems of these American forces who are confronting such a kind of open-ended and mushy, unwinnable war, right? And having to deal with a lot of the dilemmas presented by this fleeting enemy force that's so hard to pin down, and then the fractures within the units between personalities. I think Apocalypse Now is. I think it's just it's kind of like it's obviously over the top, right? But and the idea of going up to find Colonel Kurtz, on the Mekong River is kind of weird, But on the other hand, it does a great job of portraying a lot of the madness of the war. This kind of oversupplied military with too much firepower. It shows the corruption and the slackness of the rear echelons versus the hard pressed troops in the front lines, right? And so I really like that. Deer Hunter, I love Deer Hunter, the way it shows the early support for the war by the industrial working classes in this like steel town in Pennsylvania, and these guys who go off to war because because their fathers went and it's the right thing to do, and then they get to the war and they start to realize like just how intractable and strange it really is. Casualties of War with Michael J. Fox and Sean Penn, which actually describes a real situation that emerged where this platoon is out on an op, and they go through a village and they see a pretty girl and they grab her and they just take her with her on the op, and they just keep her in their campsites at night, and they rape her, and then you see this, Sean Penn leading the bad boys and Michael J. Fox, the guy who says, "Wait, what's going on here? This is wrong," and that actually happened, and that's a great dramatization of that. So I mean, there's so many to choose from, and they're all really good.
Well, Jeff, this has been an absolute tour de force. It really has. It's been extraordinary listening to this, and your book. I highly recommend it to listeners. Links are in the show notes. Extraordinary Vietnam War military history.
Oliver, I really enjoyed being on with you. I love your podcast.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks so much for listening. If you want to get in touch, you can via Spotify or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. Please do share with family and friends, but until then, thank you and good night.